coming in and telling us your story. So you're one of those relatively recently diagnosed. If one of your friends said to you, Janine, what is ADHD? What is it for you?
I think for me, I would say it's a different operating system. I'd say my brain is just as good as everybody else's, but it's working slightly differently. There are areas where it's stronger and areas where it's different. But some of the challenges that I face are perhaps less socially acceptable.
Like what kind of things?
Well, things like having time blindness, so struggling with being places on time, prioritising things, understanding how long something's going to take, those sorts of things. It's not socially acceptable to run late. But of course, that's something that it would be quite common in someone who's got ADHD and doesn't even know they have ADHD, so they're not putting in strategies to try and sort that. They're thinking, I'm just rubbish, and they're being hard on themselves. Society is probably very hard on them too. And actually, it's like, because I know that's part of the way my brain is working, and that's part of the deficit, part of ADHD. It's something that I have to work hard to manage, but I know what it is, so therefore I know what I'm trying to manage.
How did you first find out you had ADHD? How did that come about?
That came about because I worked quite a long time as an unqualified teacher, and my boss, the head teacher at the school I was working at, was like, Janine, just go and qualify. And I was in my own way, and I didn't really know why I was in my own way. I didn't know what it was I was not managing to step past. And in part of that frank discussion, she said, really, I think you need to go and speak to your GP about an assessment for autism and ADHD. And I ended up with a diagnosis for ADHD with autistic traits. And qualified as a teacher, of course. So it was that sort of like that whole being pushed to do it. And I went to see my GP, and I sat across from him, and I just burst into tears, not expecting him to take me seriously. And he sat knee to knee with me, and I told him everything, and he was like, well, I don't think you do, but you would know better than I would, because you're working in special schools, and your boss definitely would. So I'm going to make a referral, and I'm going to ask for it to go on quicker, because that might make the difference between you qualifying as a teacher and not qualifying as a teacher. So that was what happened. And that was back in 2015.
And to get that diagnosis then, what difference does that make?
It's huge, because then you start to understand why you're struggling. So some of the things that I used to do, like never paying for enough parking when I was using pay and display because of the time blindness. I will avoid pay and display now because I can't estimate how long something's going to take. I will try to pay on exit and that sort of thing. So it's making those sorts of changes, and if I have to do pay and display, buying more than I'm likely to need, and accepting that sometimes I'm going to get a parking fine as well. That's just sort of like part of the bigger picture of things. But it's things like that. It was things like making changes for myself. It was things like speaking to, because obviously I was doing teacher training at the time. It was speaking to lecturers and saying, I'm going to need help with this and this and this. This is where I'm struggling, and having that level of support as well.
Tony, you said more women than men being diagnosed at the moment. Why is that? Is that because perhaps women are going to find out more, or is that because they've been less diagnosed originally?
Yes, it is, but often they're missed, Sally, in school.
Yeah.
Again, the children who are identified are the sort of the fidgety, hyperactive boys, but ADHD presents differently in women. They are much better at They're much better at masking. Girls tend to mature quicker than boys in school anyway, so they're seen as more compliant, and invariably often just written off as low ability or not interested in education, when in fact we know that we diagnose 3 boys to 1 girl, but now we recognise that ADHD affects women just as much as men, so there is this generation of women in the UK who have lived with ADHD, many of whom have gone through a lot of the struggles that Janine has, many of whom have been treated for years for anxiety and depression, many of whom underachieved in education, which has impacted on their economic independence and their self-confidence. So I think it's really within our education system. What we've done is we label people disordered rather than seeing them as having a different type of intelligence. I mean, 1 in 10 people have got dyslexia, for example. Doesn't mean you've got a low IQ, but most children with dyslexia finish school not knowing they've got dyslexia, underachieving and thinking that they're not very bright and not very employable. And it's the same with ADHD, and the two frequently co-occur. Too often you have both.
Listening to some of the things that you talked about, the way in which your life's affected, you know, timekeeping and things like your parking meter and things like that. There'll be loads of people watching this morning. I'm among them, thinking, well, I sometimes get the parking meter wrong and I'm a bit rubbish with time management sometimes. Where is the line between ADHD and not ADHD?
That's a really good question, and it's determined by a whole set of kind of diagnostic metrics, because let's face it, we can all be forgetful sometimes, we can all be a bit disorganised sometimes, we can all find it difficult to concentrate sometimes. Often that's sometimes because we're under a lot of stress or a lot of pressure in a given situation. But for people with ADHD, that's a constant. And when somebody is being assessed for ADHD, we're looking at how those characteristics are affecting them at home, at work, and socially. And, you know, different people, we're also the product of our own experiences, aren't we? I think sometimes if you've had traumatic events as well, then you're more vulnerable to things like PTSD or anxiety and depression. So it is something that needs to be done properly by a clinician.
And how's the teacher training going? You're qualified now.
Oh, that was a long time ago now. And actually I've sort of taught for a while, and I'm no longer teaching, and actually work now solely supporting people with ADHD.
Wow.
Which is a huge turnaround, because originally when my daughter was had ADHD added to her autism diagnosis, I didn't believe in ADHD at that point, and I was angry as a mum. Yeah, I was angry. How dare you? Obviously gone complete wholesale change around that, because I invested myself in understanding rather than believing the stigma and the stereotypes and what is often put out there in the media, which is wholly incorrect and harmful.
Well, we really appreciate you coming in and enlightening us this morning and educating all of us. Thank you both very much indeed.